Hello, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel that's all about one thing and one thing only. Well, I mean, until I change my mind, and then all bets are off, I suppose. No, seriously, you might be able to tell from the name of the channel, around here the primary focus is on the English language library of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and finally the 32X. Why just the English language library, you may ask? Well, because I'm a dumb American that has forgotten all of the foreign language I learned in high school and college 25 years ago, so now my second language is in PowerShell. Yeah, I may not be able to ask where the bathroom is in Russian anymore, but I can query the hell out of a mailbox. Gdev we vania, maybe? I wouldn't trust me, you'd probably have an accent on the way. Anyway, back to the channel. Each week I pick from one of the games from those four libraries, and to be clear, I said English, and believe it or not, English is not a region when it comes to video games, so these games can technically come from all over the world. Which is the case with today's game, with this particular copy coming to me from an ex-video rental store in Australia. Why Australia? Well, because Andre Agassi Tennis for the Master System was not released in the United States. It was instead originally released as a PAL exclusive before also appearing in Brazil. Instead of the Master System version, the United States got a Game Gear port, which in turn was not released abroad and was a US exclusive. Honestly, if this game is anything like the Genesis version that I reviewed back in episode 73, the real winners here are the regions where this game was not released. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. No matter how much I dislike the Genesis version, and for those of you that didn't watch that episode, I hated it, I can't judge a book by its cover. Although we will be looking at that cover very shortly, at least the parts that aren't covered in terrible rental store stickers. But I digress. Seriously, all of you out there, I don't feel like I should have to say this, but if you're having to put stickers on something that's cardboard or paper, make sure that sticker comes off very easily, or use a post-it note as an intermediary. Because even on bad games, this is a crime. And before you start in with, well, if you don't like the stickers so much, why didn't you buy a different copy? Well, did you miss the part about how this came from Australia? This was literally the only complete copy I could find at the time that was reasonable in price, and I knew I had this review coming up in the schedule. So there you go. I bought this copy specifically for you. I hope you're happy. Okay, moving on. Andre Agassi Tennis. Fun fact, I rather enjoy good tennis games, the key there being good. I remember specifically playing a game for the Commodore 64 called On-Court Tennis when I was younger, and I had a lot of fun with it. Not just because it was a good game, but because you could play as real players, like John McEnroe, Jimmy Connors, Ivan Lendl, and Bjorn Borg. Well, along those same lines, Andre Agassi Tennis lets you play as a real player. Yeah, okay, it's Andre, and 7 obviously made up people for the game, so not quite the same thing, but they are the same characters from the Genesis version, so I guess Tech Magic was at least consistent? I don't know, maybe being consistent with a horrible game is a bad precedent, but again, I'm going to do my best to give this Master System version a fair shake. Having said that, let's go ahead and take a look at the package, and then take it to the court to see if maybe, just maybe, I can have some fun. We shall see.
Okay, and this is my copy of Andre Agassi Tennis for the Master System. Before I get too far into things, funny story. So, I mentioned how I picked this up off of eBay, and the picture looked pretty normal. It didn't appear too damaged, either physically or with water or sun damage, and it wasn't too expensive, so I went for it. Now, obviously, I saw the stickers in the pictures, but I didn't look close enough because I thought, like a sane person, that the stickers were on the outside of the clamshell, and I could just strip them off, like I've done hundreds of times for other video games. Well, that's on me, obviously, and maybe at least this will be a cautionary tale for all of you out there to check on that sort of thing before making a purchase. But the stickers being on the inner cover wasn't the only thing weird about this purchase. Oh no. Take a look at this copy of Great Baseball. You notice anything strange about it? Well, you should, because instead of being a normal Master System clamshell, the case is actually a Genesis EA case, and not just any EA clamshell. Oh no, this is one of those wide Electronic Arts boxes that they used for a while. The reason why I'm pointing this out is because that wide case is what Andre Agassi Tennis was originally shipped to me in. So I had to pick up a cheap Master System game for the sole purpose of stealing a proper clamshell from it to give to Andre Agassi Tennis. Again, it's on me for not looking closer at the game before I bought it, but it didn't even enter my mind that some lunatic at a rental shop would put a Master System game in a fat EA case. Anyway, I digress. As far as the cover goes, it should look very familiar if you've seen the Genesis version of Andre Agassi Tennis, and that's because it's literally the exact same cover except with the Genesis logo swapped out for the Master System. I actually like this cover a lot. It's a great action shot of Agassi back in his earlier attention-grabbing days before he mellowed out, cut all his remaining hair off, and married Steffi Graf. I also enjoy when the front cover wraps around to the spine, as not only does it look cool, but it helps the game stand out on the shelf. Flipping over the back, and there's another action shot of Agassi, which is again the same shot that was used on the back of the Genesis version, but this time the shot doesn't stand out as much because rather than having all the text in the white areas, they've got to be careful about space due to trying to fit in 8 different languages on the back. The screenshots used are decent and show off 3 of the 4 different courts, but they probably could have mixed it up with some non-court action. As far as the text goes, I do like the tagline at the top of "Put 'em away from the baseline." I think that's about as aggressive as you can get for tennis. But then there's this terrible supposed quote from Agassi that states, "Andre Agassi Tennis takes the same nerve and strategy it takes to be a world-class player." And I guarantee you, A, he never said that, and B, he wouldn't want to be quoted as saying that because it sounds awkward. Tech Magic used the same quote on the Genesis version, so at least they're consistent, I guess. Opening up the box and, yet another sticker on paper. This one supposedly being a security label. Right. Good job, Videomania. As far as the manual goes, usually when they try to cover 8 languages, the manuals are a bit thicker, but that's not the case here, as each language gets a massive 4 pages to explain the game. And as much as I'd like to complain about that, the game is relatively simple, so it's not like there were details that were left out when it comes to just base playing instructions. But I don't think anyone can accuse them of going the extra mile either. Okay, that's the package for Andre Agassi Tennis. Let's get to the game and see if it's any better, or worse, than the Genesis version. I mentioned in the intro that I covered Andre Agassi Tennis for the Genesis in episode 73. And to say that I didn't like it would be an understatement. I went back and checked, and for Season 2, I had that Genesis version ranked as the 4th worst game that I reviewed that year, and the only reason why it wasn't higher was because I also happened to review truly amazing titles like Make My Video, Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch, Art Alive, and Rise of the Robots during that same year. My main complaints for that version were that the controls were awful, and that the career mode that's included in the game is completely useless as there's no way to save your game. No battery backup, no password, no nothing. Which means that even if you manage to get past dealing with the horrific controls, anything you do to build your character up is futile, which just adds to the frustration factor. For the Master System version, I really didn't know what to expect, but for those of you out there that are familiar with the Game Gear version, this is apparently the same game but running at a slightly higher resolution due to the difference between the consoles. I don't own a Game Gear, and if I did, I seriously doubt I'd be playing Andre Agassi Tennis on it, so that's not really helpful to me. Anyway, if you would assume that I wouldn't have high hopes for this based on my experience for the Genesis version, you'd be exactly right. But I try to make a practice to go into each and every game with a fresh perspective, because each title, even if it's only marginally different from another version of the game that I've covered, is technically a different release, that perhaps had different programmers working on it, etc. So I think the elephant in the room is, since my biggest problems with the Genesis versions were the controls and the lack of a save function for career mode, how were those two things handled in the Master System version? Well, let's start with career mode. I can safely say that the issues I had with not being able to save my progress in career mode have been solved in the Master System port. That probably sounds like a great thing, right? Well, in the immortal words of Lee Corso, not so fast, my friend. The reason why not saving is no longer an issue in the Master System version is because Tech Magic took the nuclear option with it, and now there is no career mode available to play. No career mode? No reason to need to save your progress. It's logical. Was ripping out one of the core game modes of the game the proper answer to the problem? No, probably not, but seeing as how it was useless before, it's hard to argue that really anything was lost. It is mildly annoying though, because the idea of the career mode was one of the things that I liked about the Genesis version, and something that served to set the game apart from just being a game where you play tennis. Let's move on to the controls, which honestly was my biggest gripe about the Genesis version. While not being able to save my progress was an annoyance, not being able to actually play the game was clearly the larger issue. Tennis is something that, at its core, is as old of a video game style as it gets, going back to Pong. Without trivializing the effort that tennis players put into practice and training in real life, the game itself just isn't that complicated. Hit the ball to the other side of the net while keeping it in bounds, and don't let it fall when it's on your side of the court. This is why I didn't really have an issue with the manual for the game being so brief, as there's only so many ways to talk about playing the game. However, even with the game of tennis being relatively simple, for whatever reason, Tech Magic completely fumbled the implementation, with players feeling slow and laggy, no matter which character was used and what attributes that character had. This is a problem in a game like tennis, as it tends to be a fast-moving game outside of lob shots, and frequently you would find yourself in situations where, unless you just happen to be in the right place at the right time, the computer would win the point, especially when your character is taking its turn on the top side of the screen, which is smaller in screen real estate and usually requires even quicker reaction times. But that's the Genesis version. What about the Master System version? Unfortunately, it's pretty much the same, at least where the problems come in. I never had too much of an issue with the actual button presses, and they've more or less stayed the same, with the Master System version having one button dedicated for a standard shot and one for a lob. And when you can actually make contact with the ball, this works well, and I like how the button presses are tied to the D-pad, with being able to direct your shot, assuming you're holding down a certain direction at the same time. There's times when I wish the shots were angled a bit harder to make things more difficult on your opponent, but that's a minor complaint, and the directional targeting does work the way it's supposed to. The main issue I have is that the player animation's rotoscoped, which is great from a graphics perspective, but it also means that in order to strike the ball or move around on the court, your player has to go through a prescribed animation to do so, and this often delays your attempted response to the ball, or simply puts your player out of place, causing you to miss the ball, sometimes in hilarious fashion. Well, hilarious and frustrating, I should say. I had one play specifically when recording game footage for this video, and my player had to attempt to make a diving save to the left to return the ball, except that not only did they miss the shot, they in turn somehow dived off the edge of the screen, teleporting into the first row apparently. Not all misses are like this though, and unfortunately most of them are much more mundane. There's actually two things going on here, and both are the same problem the Genesis version had. One is the animation issues that require you to try to be in the correct position to perform your return, but then due to the simplified nature of the controls, the game will choose what type of shot your character will make when returning the ball based on your position on the screen in comparison to where the ball is. At least, it tries to. Sometimes this works perfectly. For instance, if you have a right-handed player and you position yourself just to the left of the ball, your player will hit a forehand return, assuming you time the button press correctly. But if your positioning is off just slightly, or if you're attempting to run to get the ball, all bets are off, and now we're back to the animation getting in the way of the game, as the animations seem to dictate player movement rather than the actual controls. Okay, well, I've established that the Master System version has less features and the same control issues that plague the Genesis version. But what about the graphics? Did they take a dip with the transition to an 8-bit console? Surprisingly, no. And I'm not sure if this is the case of the Genesis graphics being poor or the Master System doing better than average. There's certainly some differences between the versions if you compare them side by side, with some detail missing here and there in the Master System version, but honestly, they look incredibly similar. The graphics are definitely not something I can drag the Master System version on, and I was honestly shocked that it looked as good as it does. Unfortunately, I can't say the same thing for the audio. But it's not because the sound in Andre Agassi Tennis is bad, it's not. Instead, like the career mode, it's simply not there. During gameplay, the only way you'll even know your speakers are functioning is from the bounce of the ball off your racket or on the bounce of the ball on the ground. that's it. There are technically a few different brief fanfares that play when a game is won, but other than that, and the aforementioned 2 sound effects, the game has no audio. What is present in the game is fine, but the fact that there's so little of it is somewhat bizarre. Now, granted, Andre Agassi Tennis on the Genesis didn't have crowd noise either, or any other ambient noise for that matter. It was the same minimal sound effects for the striking of the ball, and in its defense, tennis is a game that's known for being a quiet sport, with the fans waiting until after points are won to cheer. However, the Genesis version balanced this out by having the chair umpire announce the score after every point. And while it wasn't the clearest digital speech I've heard, at least it was something to break up the silence. So, where did I end up landing on Andre Agassi Tennis for Master System? Well, from a gameplay perspective, it's really more of the same from the Genesis. I played roughly 6 or 7 matches this week, and in none of them did I come anywhere near winning a set, which was about what I was expecting. Was I able to win points or the occasional game? Sure, but this often meant that I would end up losing matches 6-0, 6-1, while barely being competitive when placed at the bottom of the screen. What I actually found the most fun about the game was playing doubles with a computer partner. I still wasn't a threat to win an overall match, but the games immediately became much more competitive when I had the computer helping out with half the action. Unfortunately, I think that serves, pardon the pun, to further the indictment against the game. When it became more fun, the less I actually had to play it. And sure, I'm willing to bet that if I wanted to spend the time to become an expert at the game, I might eventually be able to be more competitive. Might. But at what cost? Practicing to overcome poor controls doesn't seem like a good use of my time, and I feel like there has to be better tennis games available for the console. As a result, I'm giving Andre Agassi Tennis 1 star. You might ask why I decided to give the game 1 star when I gave the Genesis version 0 stars, especially since the game is missing the career mode and the digital speech from that version. And my answer is that this is the Master System version. It's understood that it would have less features, being only 8-bit and half the cartridge size. And the career mode wasn't functional in the Genesis version anyway. Ultimately, I wouldn't recommend either version of the game, but if I had to choose between the releases, I would pick the Master System version, as it's the less innately frustrating of the two, and thus, it gets a star.
Okay, that was Andre Agassi Tennis for the Master System. This is one of those games that I pretty much knew how it was going to go before I even started playing it, but at the same time, I'm glad that I still went through with the review, because believe it or not, I was impressed that the graphics in the game were as close to the 16-bit version as they were. I was actually hoping that the game engine would have been totally retooled for the Master System, possibly fixing the controls in the process, but I can at least appreciate what they were trying to do here, with emulating the version from the more powerful console. Tune in next week as it's time to play a game that I've never played before, and that I really don't know much about, except for the fact that apparently it has a reputation for being hard. Longtime viewers of the channel probably know that being hard is not a selling point for me. I am not the type to enjoy banging my head against a wall for hours just to try to make a small bit of progress. I just don't get the point. However, I'm hopeful that perhaps some of that reputation is a bit overblown, and that it ends up being like Twin Peaks pineapple habanero wing sauce, hot, but not 4 alarm bells hot. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 173. If you liked what you saw here and you want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.